Hello, everybody. Welcome to the ABT Time podcast and our special end of the year um, summary review and celebration episode. I don't think we've done an episode for a bit. And in fact, we got some new artwork here at the start of if you're looking at the video version. Yeehaw. And this is just going to be Matthew and myself talking about what went on this year in ABT land. Are you ready for that, Matthew?
I am ready. Let's fire away, sir.
All right, we've got lots to report. Very first thing I want to do is dedicate this episode to my good friend John Small in Australia, who passed away about a week ago from a heart condition, and very sad and upsetting. He was a couple years older than me. We were really good buddies. He was one of the machinists in the workshop at the Australian Institute of Marine Science, where I was a postdoctoral fellow. And he and his fellow machinists became my best buddies there. They made all this incredible equipment for me. And I think he was the embodiment of so much of what I try and preach these days with everything I do, which is these partnerships between the academic world and the non-academic world. There was not an academic bone in any of those guys down there in the machine shop. They were funny as hell, incredibly creative, the most entertaining characters I met in all my years in Australia. And Jono and I stayed good buddies for for 40 years. He came over to California at one point and spent a few days with me, catching up, and we always traded emails. So, and also we did an episode with him on the podcast here, episode
Mhm.
21 in September of 2021, and had him talk a bit about his background as a machinist and what it's like as a machinist to work with all these oddball scientists and unusual characters that they would get there at the Australian Institute of Marine Science. So here we go on this end of the year episode. And the first question you might be wondering is who exactly is your audience? People say that endlessly in communications. You need to know your audience. Um, I think for us in this episode, in this podcast, our audience is we don't give a damn.
This is
Our-
for us, people.
this is for us. It's totally for us. You know, one thing I've never understood is all these rich celebrities who have their podcasts and they're packed full of ads and commercials.
Mm.
You know, how much time and effort does it take us to do this damn podcast, Matthew? Like we record it and then you prep it a little bit and post it. And
Randy, I almost sprained my finger hitting the record button. It was
exactly.
brutal.
And then you listen to these big commercial podcasts and you have to wade through 5 minutes of their ads so they can make their money, I guess. I don't know. You'd think they'd make their money off something else. They ought to just do the damn podcast. All right, that's just me getting warmed up in grouchy mode. Okay. We got lots of grouchiness to come. So going back to our question, who's your audience for this podcast? I'll tell you who the audience is. First and foremost, it's Julie Clausen. There you go, Julie. I hope you are listening to this thing and are shocked to hear that because you are one of the long-term troopers in all this. And I know you listen to every episode of the podcast and you think deeply about it and you send back thoughts and things like that. So you are number one. Liz Foote in Australia now, who was one of the pioneers, mentioned her in the Houston book. Rick Nelson, North Dakota. These are all members of the solid core group that we had coming up on 5 years ago in April of 2020, right at the start of the pandemic. That's when we launched the course and instantly pulled together this group of about a dozen really hardcore dedicated folks who are still part of our group and endless ABT discussions. And they've been kind of, we should call them the development group, I guess.
Mm.
Absolutely wonderful. Mike Strauss, who's really kind of one of the central 3 or 4 characters still of everything that we do. Park Howell from the business world is one of our 4 guest speakers. I'm sure he'll be listening to this eventually. Diana Padilla, second of our guest speakers in the course. Nancy Knowlton, third, and Brian Palermo, the fourth. All 4 of them have probably given their presentations over 30 times now, I would say. And it's incredible to watch their presentations grow and change as we've gotten this deeper and deeper understanding of the ABT. Michael Bart from National Park Service, one of our founding guys that goes all the way back to before the ABT course. Shirley Malcolm, our guru, saint, and spiritual leader. She of Shirley's Law, and see if I can get her to listen to this episode. Jade Lovell in Australia, who took part in the separate podcast episode we did. I'll mention in a bit about Australia. Tad Harmon, my good buddy, who's working with us now with GH Labs, we're going to talk about from Seattle, and Rod Lamberts, who was in that AAAS video that we recorded all the way back in 2016 and has been on the podcast, I think, more than once. That's the hardcore group that I'm sure will listen to everything we have to say in this in the roundup, and then lots of other folks as well, hopefully. Whatever. Here we are, almost 15 years since the formulation of the ABT narrative template. It was 2011 when I first heard the South Park guys talking about these three words and button therefore and their unique dynamic. But let's be crystal clear, they did not originate the ABT dynamic. We traced it all the way back to Frank Daniel, the legendary screenwriter at University of Southern California, who in 1986 in a speech talked specifically about we always start the first drafts with the dreaded and then structure. It's in the revisions that we replace the and thens with buts and therefores. That's the origin. That is the urtext, as they say in the world of critical studies. That's as far back as we can trace it. And then from there, it jumps to the philosophers and all the way back to the Greeks. But, this is not our new branded piece of knowledge here. It's just the way it works. It's like DNA. It's the same thing. Um, so where we are is that you could say in in honor of Taylor Swift, you could say that we have had three eras. We could give our eras tour of the ABT. And era number one was the first 5 years where I was just starting to test the waters and experimenting, giving presentations, trying to figure out, is this thing really as powerful as I think it is? And getting feedback from audiences who were putting it to use and saying, this thing's really powerful. So era number one was exploration. Era number two was the first form of training, story circles. And that was sketched out at the end of the Houston We Have a Narrative book. And for 5 years, we did this in-person version of training called story circles. Primarily, Mike Strauss helped me develop it at USDA, and then we propagated it. And we ended up doing probably, I think, 50 story circles events and circles. I mean, tons and tons of circles that sprung off of that. And so that helped us develop the training itself. And then era number three is where we really kind of took it to full boil, which was the pandemic set in. The whole Zoom world opened up overnight, April of 2020. We did an experiment, and on a Monday on Twitter announced that we're going to organize this little course and let's see if we can get some people to sign up. And by that Friday, we filled all 50 slots and we were stunned like, oh my goodness, there's a lot of people stuck at home looking desperate for something to do. And that was the beginning of the ABT course, which just last month we completed the 40th round of the ABT course. And in the beginning, that first year, we were all stuck at home and so bored. I invited a whole bunch of my friends, probably 30 to 40 friends, to be guests in the course. And we were kind of probing and experimenting, trying out different people to see what matched. And what took basically were those four guest speakers that I mentioned, who are still this past fall with the Emory University Medical School round that we did for the third time with them, the same four guest speakers. So it's become a really solid, great team. The interesting thing is, why are we not making headline news? Why are we not written up in Science and Nature and all these other sorts of places? And, a part of it, I listened to Bill Burr on his podcast a couple of weeks ago. Who I'm a big fan of his ranting and raving, and he was talking about, there's no longer that much of a correlation between um, prominence, celebrity status, or whatever, and actual knowledge and quality. It's mostly a function of how good you are at working the internet. And that is absolutely the truth. And so you get a lot of these people with very mediocre talents, but are great at developing their brand and getting out there and getting a zillion followers. We just have not put a lot of effort into that because we've had a really solid, steady stream of people doing the course and booking it. And we haven't wanted to grow and become some great big money-making brand. We've mostly been a 50-50 project here, 50% towards keeping things going and training lots of people with the ABT framework, but 50% focused on developing it, digging deeper and getting an understanding. Matthew and I in particular, day in and day out, these discussions and in the middle of running sessions, hitting moments of realization like, oh my God, this is how this thing works. And we're still not entirely clear on a lot of the stuff. But that's what's different here. This is not just a training program. You can find lots of training programs for science communication. Actually, I know something, God, about probably 12 years ago, Nancy Duarte, who's the really prominent communications expert in the business world in Silicon Valley. She and I had a long talk, and she said, "You know, Randy, there's really only a handful of us that are creating the IP here. There are all these other people out there making lots and lots of money off the IP that we're creating, and that's the truth, and that's fine. You
Hmm.
know, a lot of people now are using the ABT in their communications training, and that's wonderful. And I think most of them will tell you they send me emails, and I demand that they instantly get on Zoom and have a chat because I want to learn from them. How's it going? How are you using the ABT? You know, what specifically you do with it. So it's been a great collaboration in that regard, and we are not proprietary about the ABT. We don't own it. The Greeks own it. Maybe they'll come back from the grave and try and sue you for using their the tripartite structure. But in the meanwhile, it's been fun to collaborate with people. And so that's pretty much where we are now of the moment, which is great. I mean, we're having more fun than ever. And it's just the biggest thing of all, it's puzzle solving. And every time we get another piece of the puzzle coming together, especially for Matthew and me, it's just you can feel the satisfaction, like, oh my God, that's how it works. And this year we've had a bunch of them. We'll probably talk about them in the next few minutes as we dig deeper into what we're up to. But that said, um, here's the main thing that we're going to structure this discussion around is our top five ABT developments of 2024. So we're going to start with number five and work towards number one, just like some dumb list on USA Today or something like that.
We're not
So,
above
yeah, we're not above it.
it.
That's whatever. That's how they do it. But this is how we're going to progress, and we'll work our way to the number one. And so on that note, let's begin with major development number five for the year. And this is all Matthew. I've labeled it Operation Matthew, which is that first off, I got sick to death of travel long, long ago, did too much of it as a scientist, and then way too much of it when I had my movies, Flockadodos and Sizzle. I turned into a traveling salesman where I had to just constantly travel. God, like take like 20 to 30 or 40 trips a year, go out and do screenings and talk to everybody. I just got sick of travel. And so I'm not too keen these days to get on a plane and go anywhere. But people come along and want to do workshops. And the great thing now is that through the course of 5 years working with this gifted screenwriter, Matthew David, he's gotten to the point now where he is as fluent and conversant as I in the ABT framework. And in fact, when I listen to him talk about it and we do workshops, things like that, there's no longer any voice in my head saying that's not exactly right. It's now like music to my ears. He's got it down. So on that note, for no operate number five is Operation Matthew, and at least two trips this year, one to Lithuania and one to Vermont, where you went off as our emissary. Tell us about those two and anything else that's gone on in the land of Matthew. Starting with Lithuania.
Lithuania was a very interesting experience. So I got called to go out there to Vilnius University and give a week's worth of workshops. And I was really, the big question I had in my mind was, is the ABT going to translate to Eastern Europe? Like we knew it worked in the West. We even had pretty good indications that it worked in like South and East Asia, but Eastern Europe was a big question mark in my head. Turns out the answer was a resounding yes. The audience got it. I did these workshops. I talked about the precursor to the DNA dream nightmare action, the Matthew template, which is the earth and heaven but hell therefore action kind of story of structure. And I really ran that home. And the feedback I got, there's this one kind of tenured professor that came up to me after a talk. He was like, you know what? I've been doing this like kind of tripartite structure, like for all my talks and all my research proposals for like decades. I've been missing the heaven for decades.
Oh
And
yeah.
now that you laid it out for me, it is obvious. It's obvious I need to be setting the stakes as to what positive things could happen.
How many of the people that we work with fail to even understand the heaven element?
I know, which is why I banged the drum for it for so
Yeah.
long because
It
it usually takes a while for that concept to sink in. But once it does, people are like, "Oh my God,
Yeah.
Obviously, I need to start including
Let,
that.
let's take a moment and editorialize on that a bit because I've said for years that that is the bane of the American environmental movement. They have
Mhm.
burned themselves out on beating the public up about you've poisoned the planet, you stupid people.
Mhm.
And they, for decades, have begun their communications primarily with that. Here's where it starts was you people have poisoned the planet. And they've failed to create a vision. This is why we worship the Martin Luther King Jr. I Have a Dream speech because there it is right there. I have a
Mhm.
dream. And when you look at the first paragraph, it begins with perfect ABT structure. And the very first thing he talks about is the dream, the Emancipation Proclamation. There was the beginnings of a dream. We were given a promise, and we haven't gotten the full dream yet, but at least we know what the dream is. God, all of these people, and with so many of the science folks that we work with, they don't, it takes a little bit to get them to understand the dream thing. And hasn't that come back with some of the folks we work with?
Yeah. Not only do they forget the dream thing, Randy, but when they finally get the dream thing,
Yeah.
they still get it wrong. Like one of my favorite examples was from someone who's in like pesticide regulation, and she wanted to have like safer pesticides that were safer for society that wouldn't cause like any repercussions down the line. She started her ABT with her opponent's heaven, her the pesticide manufacturers heaven, about how great pesticides have been and how much food we've been able to produce. It's like, okay, great. But the pesticide manufacturers, they're gonna make that case. You don't have to make that case for them. You can give your own version of heaven of what a world with safe pesticides look like and how much better that's going to be. Don't spend time doing your opponent's argument when you can be doing your own, which was my one of my big takeaways from that encounter. But
Interesting. It's, I think a lot of hardcore research scientists, they have a little bit of trouble at first wrapping their mind around, well, I don't work in dreams. I do research. I actually, yeah, isn't that the case?
it's totally the case. You got to understand really what the dream is. You're applying critical thinking to project into the future as to what the world is going to look like if everything goes according to your plan. That's it. And you're the one that's going to have to do it for your topic because you are the expert in that field. We, the audience, are not the expert. If there's anyone that we can rely on to give us some sort of indication as to what's going to happen, it has to be you. And if you drop that ball, then we're not going to be able to extrapolate. We're not going to be able to understand what could
And
happen.
this idea of the dream for hardcore research scientists, I promise you it's there in the brain of every single scientist because no
Mm,
matter what system you're working on, all day long you're thinking if we can just figure out this, if we can sequence this one gene, then it's the if-then tool. We learned that early on. And that is
yeah.
constantly going in the minds of good scientists, which is, this is my dream, is if we could just quantify this one thing, then that would give us the data in order to be able to put the whole model together and see how it works. It's there everywhere. It's just this literal mindedness that tends to have people jump right to the problem. Well, the problem is we haven't figured this
Yeah.
thing out. And getting people to be less literal minded. And this is very important at a deeper level because you hear amateur communications training people saying, always be positive. You must always be positive and let's lift up everybody's spirits. There's a right place in your communication for positivity. And it's crucial there at the opening that you're going in that sort of positive direction about, here's what we see for the future. But then you also have got to go in the opposite direction with contradiction. And if you fail
Mhm.
to do that, you're just giving people a bunch of hot air. And you see that all the time. And you must always be, no, it's not that simple. It's the yin and the yang. You must sometimes be really positive and then also sometimes be really, I hate to use the word negative, but critical, but it might as well use negative because that's what science, the whole profession is built around is negation, falsification. So that is how a critical mind works. It's just getting both of those things working. And that's so difficult because, as we know, the singular narrative just is constantly trying to squash you into just doing one thing. All right, I'm just going to be positive and happy. No, it's the challenge of the ABT is to do the two things. We're going to give you this positive stuff, and then we're going to say, but we're going the opposite direction. And that's why it's work. And that's why a lot of people's brains don't want to have to engage in that work and they just want to do the and things. That's so much easier. All right, tell us more about Lithuania. What was the food and weather like?
Oh well the food that's interesting because I did not know that there is basically kind of a Cold War going on between Lithuania and Poland on the origin of potato pancakes. Apparently, it's a very hot, contentious issue there. A lot of cultural strife between these
Well,
two
wait, wait.
countries.
This is not a political podcast.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm going to
I've
stop you
crossed the
right
line there a
there.
little
We're
bit.
losing listeners right now as you're getting into your politics thing again. But all right, give us another few seconds on the potato pancakes. Um, um, and what was the weather like there? You're in January, right?
I was in Eastern Europe in January, Randy. And the biggest question I got when I got there was, why did you come here in January of all times? Well, that's when you invited me.
Yeah.
I'd be happy to come back in the spring because you have some beautiful castles that I want to go visit. But no, I mean there was a benefit to going there because the Vilnius University and my hotel right in the middle of Old Town Vilnius, and it just looked like this European winter wonderland from like something out of like a Disney movie. It was just absolutely gorgeous with the old architecture and the churches and everything. Oh,
And
so
what was
so
the
wonderful.
upshot, the follow up the week or two afterwards, after you did the visit? The feeling there, had the
Oh,
ABT fly?
Oh, it it flew really well. At one point, so I started one day with giving them the lecture, like a 90-minute kind of introduction to the ABT, and the last half of the week was basically narrative gym workshops where I would like work with members of the audience on their ABT, I kind of live in front of a live studio audience, pulling their ABTs apart and rewriting them, like using their feedback so that everyone could see how the process worked. And at one point, one of the one of the older professors just kind of blurted out, like, Matthew, this feels like therapy for scientists. I was like, okay, so this must be going over well.
Actually, we can jump from that moment to the exact same moment in Vermont in what was that, maybe October, that you went
Yes.
there. And tell us about that because you were doing live stuff with them that worked really well as well. Tell us about that exercise.
Oh, so many great moments. So that was with I got flown to Vermont to do a day of training with VHB, which is like they're one of the biggest consulting firms on the East Coast. They're market wise, they're one of the biggest, while being like company wise, one of the smallest.
What does VHB stand for?
VHB stands for
You went
thing
to their
and thing
workshop,
and
don't even
thing.
know.
Yeah, exactly. That's not fair. On their website, it's just VHB. It's not like anywhere.
Very hot bodies.
Very hot bodies. Um, well, Randy, your friends work there. You should know what it stands for. Like, throw this on me.
That's what we did with this one, which was great. And so, okay, anyhow, tell us about the demographic of who the people you were working with there. These were engineers, right?
Yeah, primarily engineers, a lot of the old guard that had been working at the company for forever, for ages. And it was really interesting because so engineers and kind of like middle management, like leadership kind of people. And these are people that have been working there for a while, from a time when the company was still super small. The company is starting to get to that threshold where now, for like the first time ever, they're starting to have an outer circle audience that's not just outside the company, but within the company as well. So they're starting to have to like rethink their
Oh,
community.
wait. Slow that down. That's pretty interesting. Say that
Yeah,
again.
yeah. I'm not sure they realized that, but that's what's happening. So they started out a really small company where they could talk inner circle and to each other across the company all
Oh,
day
wow.
long,
Yeah.
and everyone was completely on the same page with what they're talking about. Now they're getting big enough; they're starting to cross like a threshold where. So for this leadership team, for instance, they had written this memo, this almost 1,000 word memo that they were so proud of about what VHV is going to look like 5 years into the future. And everyone on that team, everyone in that inner circle team was super proud of that memo and how wonderful it is. And it's just like really like jazz them up as like, yeah, this is what our company's going to be. They showed that to the VP above them, who said, this does not connect with me at all. They showed it to their staff under them, who said, we can't make heads or tails of this.
You know, that is so much like just last week working with the people from FAA.
Mm.
Federal Aviation Administration, and several of them had ABTs that were about the problem of silos. And
Yeah.
isn't that the same thing? Silos end up being inner circles, multiple inner circles that can speak their own language, and then the next silo over can't understand it. Interesting. So how'd that go? You did a rework on that memo?
We did after I gave the lecture, we spent like another hour reworking the memo. We broke everyone off into teams and each one reworked a part of the memo, trying to like forge it into a problem solution dynamic. And the feedback we got was once they actually added the problem, it felt like even they got a better grasp as to what the memo was all about and how they were going to get there. The one of the major problems of that memo. Okay, so what is the definition of a narrative? A narrative is a journey in the search for a solution to a problem. So journey, solution, problem. That memo didn't have any problems. It didn't have a journey from the solution to the problem. It didn't even really have the solution.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
It was the aftermath of this is what it's going to look like after we've already solved everything.
Yeah, boy. Wow.
Everyone in that room saw the journey, the solution, the problem because they could read between the lines.
Right.
They were inner circle. The narrative was clear for them. Everyone outside that room could not see any of it because it was not there on the page. Super interesting to see that play out in real life.
Well, and on that theme of a journey, it's time to move on to our item number 4 for the
Hmm.
year, which is really monumental. And this is a journey in itself, which is all the work we've been doing for 2 years now with Global Health Labs in Seattle. They are funded by the Gates Foundation. They're intimately associated with them. Began 2 years ago when their CEO, Steve Kern, asked me to come up and run the course the first time through. And then we found a lot of people there really getting the ABT and putting it to use, and just a great demographic of people. They have probably about 100 or so people there. They are basically kind of the innovation lab for the Gates Foundation's work on global health. So they come up with a problem and then bring it to Global Health Labs, and they set to work with their engineers and solving these problems, developing devices, and just doing very important cutting edge work. The two groups we've ended up working a lot with there is the group developing an affordable transportable diagnosis device for tuberculosis for all these countries uh, in far-flung places. And then also their machine learning group, their AI group. And those two groups we've done a lot of work with, and they've been so much fun. We worked with the head of the TB group on his Gordon conference talk that he gave in the spring. And we probably worked with him for 2 to 3 months on that talk, and it was tremendous. And he listened very closely, went through multiple drafts, shaping it into this ABT structure, having him tell a good story. And he gave the talk and came back, and it was so good. He gave a talk to everybody there at GH Labs about this is how this thing worked and worked so well. Same thing happened with the fellow who's the head of their AI group. He gave a big talk the previous fall, came back and gave a talk to everybody there at GH Labs to explain to them these are the elements of the ABT that worked really well. As a result of all of that, we ran the course several times with them, did a number of different projects, did the DBT training with them. Really, probably 50 to 60 of the 100 people I would say have done the course or the DBT training at this point, maybe more than that. And then the amazing thing took place was last summer, or
Hmm.
this past summer, we ended up working with their 12 summer interns that they have every year. And these are not like low-level interns. These are like early career scientists that they have,
Hmm.
postdocs or starting research scientists mostly. And every summer they have a dozen of them. They work with each one has a sort of mentor supervisor whose lab they work in. And then at the end of the summer, they all have to give a presentation. Well, what we did with this group was we ran them through the whole course, the 10 1-hour sessions, which was wonderful. It laid down a foundation of understanding of the ABT for them. Then in August, in groups of three, like every Friday, they gave their presentations, and we worked with them. For the first time ever, we developed this set procedure of how we applied the ABT to their presentation and broke it into 3 or 4 different steps. Um, starting with number one, the narrative gym step, where we do a half-hour session that involves 15 to 20 people all in a session working with the one person's ABT. Then secondly, the what we now are calling slide dissection, where they put together their slideshow and we set to work on dissecting them and helping further apply ABT and basically the arouse and fulfill principle to how they present it. And then thirdly, a couple of rehearsals and things like that. And then finally, the formal presentation. And that was transformative for us. And the reason it was transformative is that we've done this course for coming up on, it was coming up on 40 times then. Um, and we've always ended the course just by saying, okay, now you got the basics, go to work. This is the first time we've ever applied it and developed an application stage where we said, now we're going to take that knowledge you've gotten in the 10 1-hour sessions, and now we're going to work with you on your presentation, and we're going to develop it and solve the puzzle and get the structure of ABT for you. And I think that in doing that, you will see where the power lies with all these different changes that we make for you. And that's what we did. And how did it go, Matthew?
Oh, it went wonderfully. The feedback we got from the staff was that this was like the best round of intern presentations ever. And I think when we look back on this, so you talked about the three eras earlier of the ABT, the
Right.
the testing, the story circles, and the Zoom course. I think when we look back, this will be the start of the fourth era.
I think so. Exactly.
Because I think this application actually showing people how to actually apply it to presentations is going to be transformative. We had this kind of mindset earlier that, and this works for a lot of people. I think this does work for a lot of people, that if we teach them the ABT, if we can get them to figure it out in an ABT build and a working circle, condensing all of their work down into one sentence and seeing how the structure works, then they'll be able to take that last little jump and start applying it to their own kind of proposals and presentations and that kind of thing. And I think for a lot of people that's true, but others need that extra little bit of help, that extra little bit of help taking it from theory and that one sentence structure to applying it to something that they're actually going to be using in the world, like a 5 minute presentation. And for those people, there's a moment that a lot of these interns hit, I think, where it's like, oh, we've really cracked the nut on this. This is how I'm going to get this across. This is how I'm going to be able to communicate this to like people who are not just in my lab, but to the CEO said, he wanted presentations that the interns could take back to their universities and give to their fellows there, and everyone would be able to understand. And that's what we got. And I
Yeah.
don't think we'd ever really gotten quite to that level before.
No, exactly. And in fact, we've got more to say on the application workshop, but let's
Yeah.
let's stop for a moment on that because we'll circle back to it. Let's move on to item number three, which we don't have a ton to say on that. It's the three-part podcast special that we did earlier this year on basically um, these sort of failure to listen experiences. And what happened was, old friend of mine in Australia told me about what happened last year in Australia. They had a vote, national referendum, trying to rewrite their constitution to give a stronger voice to the Aboriginal nation in Australia. It failed pretty substantially, and it was a huge disappointment. And as I heard the details of what happened there, I instantly connected with the story that I got to know intimately 10 years ago in the state of North Dakota, thanks to our buddy Rick Nelson, who's a part of our group. And he brought me in 2015. They had run a conservation initiative, ballot initiative there to try and allocate 5% of the state's oil and gas revenues to conservation issues. And the environmentalists who got behind the whole thing did a catastrophic job of failing to listen. They
Mhm.
simply assumed that the whole state was dying to do more work on conservation of wildlife. They poured $4 million into this campaign that was just not well thought out at all. And there was an arrogance to it. And I hate to say this, and as I said earlier, we don't want to get into politics on this podcast, but the night after the election last month, um, and the reelection of Trump, Van Jones, who's really a great environmentalist, was on CNN on a panel, and in classic Dobzhansky fashion, he said, "I boiled this whole experience down to one word, and that one word is elitism among the Democratic Party, that the party's been taken over with an elitist attitude, a feeling of entitlement, like you people just need to listen to us and let us do what we're going to do because we're so good about it. It was really great what he had to say. And that's precisely what went on in the state of North Dakota. So a number of people with the money and an elitist attitude took the money and hired communications people from three places, Washington, D.C., New York City, and San Francisco, and brought them into this completely rural state of North Dakota, heavily industrialized state of North Dakota, and let them run the whole communications campaign. And they did the same thing that they would do in New York City, which was to create some media and just, try and use the television airways to recruit the public behind the thing. It just made the assumption that everybody wants this. And the net result was that thing lost 80% to 20%. They got crushed. And so it was the similarity between that and what went on in Australia. It's this failure to listen. And this is really what Brian Palermo has done more than 30 of our sessions, giving his presentation with group after group on the need to listen to be able to communicate effectively. And it is the bane of heavily educated people. They have a tendency to get caught up in their head to the point where they're no longer listening. They're just positive. Their solutions are wonderful and meant to be. So that was the podcast that we did. We ran through those two case studies in the first two episodes, and then the third one had a panel discussion with a couple of our favorite people from Australia, Jade Lovell and Rod Lamberts. And that's kind of a three-part series that I don't think has quite changed the human race, but it's out there and we enjoy doing it. And I think it's just helps make this point further in case studies of you just got to make sure that you listen to the public. And it's just so hard for heavily informational people. That's item number three on our major events of the year. Item number two is going to be very brief, which is really a 15-year intensive project that I've been working on, which is the further development and communication of the two books that my father wrote about his experiences in World War II. He was part of a really catastrophic event at the beginning of World War II in the Philippines and wrote two books about that experience. And I've been slowly developing that material and now writing intensely in and around it this year. And I just wanted to share one fascinating little detail from that because this is pure ABT, and I don't think I've really talked to you about this, Matthew, but
Mm.
um, a lot of the whole experience there in the Philippines was built around the probably the most famous American general next to Washington, maybe, which is General Douglas MacArthur. He was the head of everything there, and he made some major mistakes. They ended up the Japanese invaded the Philippines, and he ended up having to escape there and leave behind the troops because the president Roosevelt didn't want him to get captured himself. So he and his staff escaped to Australia. And in a famous speech that he gave, right when he got to Australia to a group of reporters, he said this one line that was very carefully crafted and thought out because they'd been working on it before he even left the Philippines. And he built to a point about what he'd left behind there and his determination to get back there. And then he said three words that became really his words that he was remembered by, which is, I shall return. And, many years later, when Arnold Schwarzenegger said, I'll be back, he was basically emulating the same catchphrase for an entire generation, I shall return.
That was real MacArthur energy.
Exactly, right. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, it's that sentiment, but the interesting part when you read about what went on there was that even before he left the Philippines, as I say, he and his staff were developing this as a message, basically. He had very deep narrative intuition. He knew how to work with the media and how to communicate effectively. And they were trading memos with what was called the Office of War Information in Washington, D.C. And the people at the Office of War Information begged him to please reword that to make your three words be, we shall return, not I shall return.
Nope. Nope.
And
Nope.
when he got to
Nope.
Australia, he ignored all their pleas and recommendations, went with I shall return. And when you dig deeper into what went on there, the historians have done their analysis, but the historians don't understand narrative structure. They do not. They don't get it. They'd be better communicators if they did, but they fundamentally don't know that. And they really, they're so drawn to and. Historians want to get every single piece of information in there at the expense of story structure, and they hate Hollywood and storytelling because they tell a good story at the expense of all that information and accuracy. But what the historians did was looking at that phrase, I shall return. They said that was an example of MacArthur's gigantic ego, that it had to be about him. I. It's all about me, 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 me. It's not about we, that he couldn't be inclusive. And this is very relevant to today's struggles around this word inclusiveness. And there is a battle there that I don't think the people behind it realize, of what's going on with narrative dynamics, which is that being inclusive and letting everybody speak at once, it leads to failed communication. It's not as simple as that. At any rate, what MacArthur found, what everybody found, was that that phrase went out immediately and began to get picked up. And most importantly, the people he'd left behind, not so much the Americans, but the Filipinos who felt abandoned by Americans, they admired MacArthur. They trusted him. They no longer trusted the American government, but they loved that phrase. They propagated everywhere. I shall return. They lived by that phrase for the next 2.5 years as they waited for the Americans to come back. But more importantly, it gets right to the heart of the Nicholas Kristof article that we use endlessly, and this basic principle of the power of storytelling rests in the specifics. There's nothing more specific than the singular, one person. I mean, Homer knew this. This is what the Odyssey and the Iliad are about. He came back and told his story. I went here, I did this. That is where narrative is at its most powerful, with the singular. And had he gone with we shall return, it just isn't as powerful. And you can look in the eyes of the one person saying, I shall return. And there's a meaning and power there to it that's not there with a committee and thousands of people. And that's a narrative dynamic that's not even written up in these history books that I'm reading about this thing. But I guarantee you that was a driving force there. Does that all make sense to you, Matthew?
That all makes complete sense. So much to say. First off, brilliant instincts from MacArthur. It's a classic simple hero's journey that he created. There was once a great
Yes.
and mighty general, but he
Oh,
was
yeah.
since fell
Yes.
fell low. Therefore, he had to return and undo the mistakes of the past. Like absolutely brilliant. And there's this really interesting, useful lens to look at the world from. I'm not exactly sure where it came from. Maybe like the simulation theory people, but whatever. It's the lens that if you look at the world through the lens of what would be the most narratively interesting outcome, that's what is going to happen. So the narratively interesting like journey of a general that was like all high and mighty, but then fell low, then had to come back. Of course,
Yes.
that's what's going to happen. Like if you look at the world through that lens, of course, that's what's going to happen. So,
Exactly. But again, historians don't have that lens. I mean,
mm,
there's no analysis of history that I've come across that is looking at it from even the hero's journey perspective. It's
yeah.
really, that's very non-literal. So it's hard for them to do that. And again, all these books just itemize, they're just almost resumes. This happened and this happened, this happened. And then sadly, when other people try to structure it more, let's not go any further on this, but I can tell you, my father went to his grave wanting to strangle an author named Hampton Sides, who wrote a best-selling book about the raid on Cabanatuan at the end of the World War II in the Philippines.
Mm.
And he did things in there where he took real events and reframed them to make them more important than they really were. My
Oh,
father was there. He saw how these things went down and he read these things and like it wasn't like that. That's not true. And he did it to tell a better story. And you know, that's what happens. And so that was a case of a storyteller getting in there and reworking real history and ending up with a pile of crap. And it's pretty bad what that guy did. So, and I could go on and on about the details behind that, but we got to move on too. Okay,
mm.
that is then our top four, and now for the grand finale is what we left off with on number four that we were talking about in the case of GH Labs, which is this development of what we're calling now the application workshop. And it's really, you're right, it's the fourth. I hadn't even thought about this. This is turning into the fourth era for our development of the ABT,
Mm.
which is that we had failed to see the last 4 years, that you really need this last bit, which is to take the ABT and apply it to a presentation. And it's in developing that presentation and starting off with something that's a mess and eventually shaping into something that's really powerful and tight That's a whole journey that's very powerful and transformative. And
Yeah.
so the result now is that this year, the most monumental thing we did this year was we did this 3 times. We did it first off with the GH Lab folks, and that was such a good experience in August that we just sat up like, why haven't we been doing this before? We quickly added it on to the work we did with Emory University Medical School. This fall was the third time in a row we've done with the medical students there, taught the ABT course. And this time we did all 10 of the 1 hour sessions that ended at the end of October. Then we tacked on 3 more weeks in November where we did this application workshop. And so the way that worked in the 3 weeks, the first week, I draw the parallel to natural selection, where you've got two main stages. You've got the random stage and then you've got the selection stage. So the first week is the random variation stage, basically brainstorming. In the first week, everybody had to do a half-hour narrative gym, and then everybody else was required to show up there, and we had whole groups coming to it. And the narrative gym is this process where we go through 5 questions that you're generating all this variability. Everybody's taking their own shot at what they think these 5 elements should be. And then at the end of the half hour, you bring it back down into you pick what really works there. So the first week was that generating the sort of brainstorming. Second week was slide dissection, where everybody's now put together their 5 minute presentation. We dive in and then using especially the arouse and fulfill principle, just do a complete, those sessions are an hour long. And you and I and Liz Strauss, the three of us, took each presentation and dissected it. And then basically it's puzzle solving. We might as well be sitting there, the kitchen table with a 1,000 piece jigsaw puzzle in which we're just moving pieces around. What if this? What if we put this over here? What do this? And then you begin to hit these moments. Of, oh, wow, that's much more powerful. We have that at the beginning or who knows what.
Mm.
And then we have them do their recorded slideshow. And then in the third week, we had a little mini symposium. So we did that with the medical students there. And then we thought that was so good that we did it again on our own in December and sent out a little announcement and said, hey, everybody who wants to do this new thing, the ABT application workshop, we called it Nailing It. And we got a dozen people that signed up for that. And so we worked with them in the month of December, the same structure, the 3 weeks, week 1, week 2, week 3, and then the little mini symposium that just happened last Thursday. And that one was the best one of all. I think most of those talks were a tiny bit less complex. Some of the intense
Mm.
science talks, 3 weeks wasn't still quite enough to completely get all the way through clarifying everything they had to say. Whereas the people in the December workshop, really, I think every one of those we cracked the nut and got them to exactly where we wanted to. Um, Give us your thoughts on how those two workshops went in December and November.
I thought they were absolutely brilliant, and I want to do these nailing it workshops again and again and again. I think this is going to be just like when we started doing the ABT training back in April of 2020, start of the pandemic. It was a kind of R&D development phase for us as we started learning more and more and more by this like rapid iteration of doing it over and over and over again. I have a feeling the presentation workshop is going to be the same thing. I mean, even just applying the ABT to presentations, we're already like leagues ahead, I think, of like a lot of other people who try to teach this sort of thing. But and as great as we are, I think we're only going to get better from here every time we do this.
Well, you
So,
know what? One of the revelations that hit us a week or
mm,
so ago is that, as I've said all along, ABT is everything.
yeah.
And I will continue to fight for that. And once upon a time, 10 years ago, I was in a group email with a bunch of top climate scientists, and one of the toppest of them all decided to just stomp on me and say, oh, Randy, you just think the ABT is a hammer and everything's a nail. And it's 10 years since that unfortunate moment. And I'm more convinced he's absolutely right about that. It is. The ABT is a hammer and everything is a nail.
Everything is a nail. So
Everything
what can
is a
you
nail.
do?
I'm
What can you
sorry.
do?
It's all narrative. This is going back to the beginning of time. This is how the brain is shaped around this tripartite structure
The
instead
problem
of problem
solution
solution.
dynamic.
Yes, the
It's
more we
literally
work
how
with
our brain
it
works.
is, the more we work with it, the more we see it, and people slowly get this. And again, going back to Bill Burr's point that, if you're not out there working the internet, then people don't think you're working on anything interesting because you don't have a million followers.
Man.
That hasn't interested us enough. What's really interested us is hitting these moments of realization. And the big thing that hit me 2 weeks ago working during that slide dissection is that without narrative structure, all your enthusiasm is not only a waste, it's counterproductive. It's even insulting to audiences.
Mm.
To get up there and give a talk that you're wildly enthusiastic and nobody can make any sense out of what the hell you're talking about, after a while, they just start to feel like this is a lot of bullshit, really. And enthusiasm is super duper powerful and important. This is why Brian Palermo's improv training is potentially so important, but it's all got to be done judiciously. And if you want some deeper understanding of that, our episode that we did with Bruce Block, the visual expression guy from USC, was a really great discussion that we had. And I took his course 30 years ago when I was there. And his core point was that everything has to serve the narrative.
Yeah.
All of these fireworks that you can do visually in a movie, all these great things, it's all got to be there working to support this narrative. Because if you're not supporting the narrative, then it's distracting, it's going the wrong direction. And that's what happens is that enthusiasm is a wonderful thing, but if it's not being used judiciously and supporting the narrative, then you're annoying people. And if you do it properly, you're laying out a whole well-structured narrative that eventually builds to the climax. And then right there is where you finally jump in with the true enthusiasm. And you feel enthusiastic. Why? Because you've worked so hard in this thing, you've cracked the nut, you know the story that you're telling, and you've earned the right to be enthusiastic. And not only that, the audience is also consensus. Like this guy really knows what he's talking about. I'm with him, and I love it that, now that we're at this point. But if all you do is just sit there, I mean, I hate to share this little story. Once upon a time, a university had me come visit as a guest, and they had this frog guy, and they said he's the best
The
frog
frog
storyteller
guy.
ever. Have I ever told you about this guy?
Yeah, you have. But
Oh
good,
my
good, good.
God.
This
And they
is good.
plopped me down in his office for a goddamn hour. And I had to sit there for an hour as he told me his frog quote stories. They weren't stories. They were and things about, then this frog, when it mates, it goes and does this, and it makes this song, and it's this. And then this other frog over here, it looks like this color. And I just sat there staring at the floor
Like
after.
a
Like,
living,
why?
breathing frogfacts.com
Oh,
guy. Like,
yeah.
oh my
Why do
God.
I have to wade through this? I don't care how enthusiastic you are, buddy. You're not telling me a story. There's no setup problem solution dynamic going on here. And as a result, you're just pounding me. I have no intrinsic interest in frogs. I'm really, really sorry.
How dare you? How dare
Yes.
you, sir?
Yeah. And it's this catchphrase I love to use nowadays. None of this interests me. And cutting somebody off. We do that at GH Labs sometimes. And I try and apologize with it, but it's true. I'm not
Mhm.
interested in your content. I'm really fascinated by trying to get your story straight, help you get the structure. And as a result, that's why this improv stuff needs to be done judiciously. It's not as simple as teaching people how to jump around and be enthusiastic. They've got to be using it. It's got to be the icing on the cake being this really tough nut. And that kind of leads me to one of our final points here. And maybe in some ways, a little asterisk, one extra point beyond our number one event of the year. Quite possibly the very best event of the year could turn out to be this fellow that we met from the National Committee for Quality Assurance, our buddy Andy Reynolds. And he came along at the beginning of the year, maybe at the end of last year.
Mhm.
And he said, I am like the nightingale. And that is the name of the bird, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. The nightingale bird. And the deal with the
I keep wanting
nightingale.
to think like, what is it? Mockingjay? No, that's Hunger Games.
No,
Nightingale.
and
Yes,
it worries me.
Nightingale.
I'm thinking of Florence Nightingale, and I don't want to get confused. But yeah, he said, "I'm like the nightingale. The nightingale bird. It knows how to sing this amazing song, but the juveniles don't have any ability to sing the song until they hear it sung by an adult, and then when they hear it sung, they can instantly do it." And he said he feels like an ABT Nightingale, where he's known the song of the ABT his whole career. He was ready to sing it, he just hadn't come across it. And then about a year ago, right now, he started reading about the ABT and got in touch. And this is quite possibly the best development of the year because he and another of his coworkers there, he's head of communications for them, and he did the December workshop that we just finished last week. Um, and this is their organization is about healthcare. They are what do they have? 400 employees and
Mhm.
$100 million budget. So they're a major national organization that goes around
The,
and
the major national organization for healthcare that you've never heard of
that's
before.
right, exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah,
because they work on the back end. They're business to business,
they
basically.
sort of certify a lot of hospitals and systems and things like that with their quality assurance. But it's very challenging work that they do, involves a ton of information. And so he spent the whole year working on ABT, and he and I have had tons and tons of conversation. I finally told him in the fall, you really need to do this December workshop. And he did. And he put in, he's the first to tell you, he put in a zillion hours working on the talk that he gave. And last Thursday, he gave the talk and 5 minute presentation, just incredibly clear, simple, clean, white slides
Hmm.
using getting a lot of use out of the DNA structure, dream nightmare action that our friends David Pullen and Sarah J. McKechnie in the UK have developed. They've taken the ABT and modified it into that version, which we're using quite a bit, and it's really great. Um, and he just gave, and I think that he had told us that that presentation is not for public consumption right now. It's still internal stuff. But the talk that he gave was just really stunningly crystal clear
Yeah.
and so easy to follow. And I think for inner circle and outer circle, I think it had this is the deal. This is the fractal nature of narrative is that if you crack the nut really well like that, the inner circle can see these simple things in there and their brains can radiate instantly into, well, that thing, I know that's the tip of this whole big iceberg. So they get it and it's playing for them at one level. And then the broader audience, the outer circle, because it's got good structure, is also following it as well. They don't know the depth of what all these things represent. But that was a real joy working with him, was it not, Matthew?
Yeah, it absolutely was. He took it so seriously, and he even did it on hard mode. Most people who take these workshops, the biomedical people at Emory, the GH Labs people, and everyone else in the Nailing It workshop, they were all working with subject matter which they were 100% familiar. So it was just kind of a matter of like shaping that into their narratives. Andy went the extra like yard to do thing to put into his narrative things at his company that he wasn't an expert at. So he really had to do that extra work. But by doing it, he got mastery over it by like applying this like kind of critical thinking ABT framework to it. It gave him a deeper understanding of all the subject matter and allowed him to be able to communicate it more effectively to everyone else. He absolutely nailed that
And it
project.
was like every time we asked it, did this take a lot of effort? He would just go, oh, exactly. You have no idea how many hours I put in to crack this nut and make it happen. So, all right, that's our list of our, I think five, even five and a half best accomplishments of the year that we're thinking of.
Hmm.
And then let's wrap this up with just a couple words about what's on the schedule. We're going to be doing a climate workshop with Julie Clausen's group in January.
Mm-hmm.
In February, I believe we're working with Perry Marine Lab, I think, and Craig Dahlgren.
Yep.
And then we've got some other groups that are lining up their ducks and lots of other things. And I think we're thinking of probably doing that workshop we just did, the Nailing It workshop, doing that again in March. I think that would be, let's
Yep.
start the
We
wheel.
had a few people that were bummed they missed out on the this last round. So yeah, I
Okay,
say we
yeah,
absolutely do it
let's
again.
start and you know what? I think we're gonna have to limit it to 12. I think that was the perfect size.
Yeah.
Originally thought we might have it at 20, and then
No,
it really 12 was just the right amount because it's a lot of time that we put in there.
it is. It is.
Yeah. Um, but anyhow, all right. And on that note, I think that will do us for the year of 2024. I hope everybody is having a wonderful holiday season here and send us your ABT thoughts and examples and case studies that you see out in the real world because we always are fascinated to hear every single example of ABTs. You get so many emails from people saying, "Hey, I just saw this thing. It's got perfect ABT structure." It's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. Narrative is everything. And you got a final holiday message for everybody?
Yeah, when if you're at having a holiday moment with relatives and there's something you disagree about, try to find agreement first before you go into any kind of problems with the family.
That is practical advice. Well played. That is excellent. You're right. Yeah, try right when the family starts having their annual meeting.
Their moments, let's say. Yeah. See if you can find some sort of agreement first before you launch back into
There's
the
an old
problem.
Saturday Night Live skit where they're singing, "Leave me alone, just go away. I'll be all right. I'll be okay." Everybody at Thanksgiving dinner all screaming and yelling at each other. Yeah, no, I was raised with that in a family of five kids where every holiday was a meltdown. So there you go. You're right. If only we'd known ABT, we might have gotten along a little bit better. Begin with the agreement before you get into, you know what your problem is. Okay. All right. Happy holidays, everybody, and see you in the new year.
See you in the new
Bye-bye.
year, King. Bye.